All right, much of mammalian physiology is tied to the endothermic strategy of their thermoregulation. And we've talked a little bit with their evolution and how a lot of their evolution was tied to these processes which enabled them to have a higher metabolism, to maintain an internal body temperature greater or lesser than their environment. And so we're going to be talking a lot about temperature, but also some other things which allow mammals to be very diverse in the habitats in which they occupy. So first off, you have thermoregulation, which is how an organism is able to regulate its body temperature. And there are a few different ways in which they can do that. In an ectotherm, they rely on their external environment to regulate their temperature. So reptiles are a great example of this. They elevate their body temperature by going out in the sun and basking in the sun, and then when they are warm enough, they will use that heat for their metabolic activity, and then hide in the shadows when they need to cool off. Endotherms, however, rely more on their metabolic processes, so their internal processes for increasing their temperature. Now, ectotherms are generally poikilothermic, where they vary their temperature with their surroundings. And endotherms are generally homeothermic, where they maintain a constant temperature despite their surroundings. If they're in a colder environment, they will increase their metabolic processes, and vice versa in a warmer environment. Heterotherms then alternate between the two, poikilothermic and homeothermic, and there are different strategies in heterothermy, but some mammals can, to some degree, vary then their strategy depending on their life history and their environment. So the advantages to endothermy are that it allows the maintenance of a higher level of activity through whether it's cold or dark or warm, they can maintain that level of activity. However, the cost of that is they have to have the energy readily available to regulate that body temperature. So they have to constantly be taking in nutrients or energy to be able to do that. When you compare across mammals, there are some trends. Metatherians, here you can see, are generally have a lower basal metabolic rate than eutherians. That's not always true. Monotremes have a much lower body temperature than other eutherians. But the basal metabolic rate seems to be because the reproductive rate of eutherians is much greater than it is in metatherians. Not due to thermoregulation abilities. They actually are very similar in their ability to thermoregulate across those large taxa, but the difference is in the output of their young, their reproductive rate. Basal metabolic rate does seem to scale with size. Well, it does. And this has to do with the energetics required for a surface area to low volume ratio. And that seems to put a limit on how small mammals can be. So the mass shrew, and there's a bat that's also just barely 2 grams. It seems to be as small as it can be. But once you get into these larger organisms, their metabolic rate is much lower. Generally, however, they all seem to have the same number of heartbeats, which is interesting. All right, so we're going to then look at how mammals handle the cold environment and the warm environment. First, in a cold environment, mammals are generally larger, or one adaptation to a cold environment is just being large. By being large, you have a smaller surface area to volume ratio, which means less of your body is exposed to the cold, and so more of it can be contained within the internal environment. An example of this is Bergmann's rule, which basically states within species, the variance within that species in colder environments will be larger compared to those in warmer environments. And that is, again, to conserve heat. Another adaptation to cold would be insulation. So fur density and fur thickness decreases the amount of thermal conductance, so how much temperature or how much heat can escape from the body. So the sea otter has a greater density of fur than any other mammal because it needs that to protect against the cold water environment in which it lives. Other mammals that are in the marine environment rely more on blubber thickness rather than fur, and so they are generally much less hairy or have much less fur, almost hairless, but their blubber thickness reduces that thermal conductance. Some other adaptations to the cold environment include regional heterothermia. We talked about heterotherms before that can change their temperature. In many organisms in the cold, they can circulate blood to their extremities in different ways. One way is with a countercurrent exchange system. And what this does is basically the heat between the arteries and the veins are allowed to exchange heat. So the warm blood coming from the heart releases heat to the venous blood coming back to the heart so that it's warmed up on its way in. And there's also a network of capillaries towards the skin which can vasoconstrict and vasodilate. If it's cold, it can vasoconstrict, so less blood is going to the surface, and thus regionally they can allow their extremities to be cold while their core remains the same. Another strategy with that is to shunt blood away from the skin by using transverse blood vessels. Temporal hypothermia is where mammals will go into a reduced temperature, and this depends. Different organisms have different strategies. There are some organisms, very small shrews, which have daily torpor or daily reduction in temperature, and then they arouse out of that during their activity part of their day. Or you can have seasonal temporal hypothermia, which is considered hibernation, where there is a reduction in body temperature over a large period of time over the winter. All right, so here then is a countercurrent exchange system of an artery and all these veins, which they run past each other in opposite direction to allow heat to exchange. And interestingly enough, these marine mammals have these, and they as well have a countercurrent exchange system which goes to their testes, which allows their testes to remain in a cooler environment compared to their core. This here is a bear which goes through hibernation, a long period of time, in which it reduces its body temperature. And you can see it's not just flatlining at this lower temperature, it actually goes through these cycles. But these reduced temperature times are where it's saving energy during the cold temperature months where there isn't food available anyway. Heat, on the other hand, it offers a much more challenging situation for mammals. So there are a few strategies for reducing heat. One includes evaporative cooling, which can occur in two forms, either through sweat glands on the skin or through saliva. So panting exposes the wet tongue to the air, and evaporation off of that will allow cooling to occur. The efficiency part of saliva, of panting, is that it does not lose salt, and if done in the turbinate bones, in the nasal mucosa, you can have cooling as well as evaporation and condensation to retain some of that water as well. You can also pant at any time, and the breathing, the shallow breathing that accompanies that, allows airflow over that surface, so evaporation is continuous, whereas with sweat, you need some sort of breeze in order for it to be effective. So if there's no wind, then it's not very effective. There's also adaptive hyperthermia, so allowing the body temperature to raise. Camels do this, and in the heat of the day, they can elevate their body temperature, which then dissipates slowly over the cool of the night. So they essentially store that body heat and release it slowly so that they can use it. One of the problems with heat is, mammals still have to move around and get their food, and exercise, when they go and do that, also causes their body temperature to increase. And this causes problems, especially those with bursts of speed, such as cheetahs. And actually the limit on how long a cheetah can run very fast is based on overheating. So at a certain point, it has to stop running or it will overheat and die. On the other hand, the gazelle running from the cheetah or antelope or whatever, it generally increases its temperature. So this is hyperthermia in response to running away from the cheetah, and then also has a lot of sweat. There are many behavioral thermoregulation adaptive measures that mammals will take, including, in crevices of rocks, or some wood rats will actually make wood middens out of sticks where they can stay in the shade, basking, and they will even do this to warm up their body temperature. So any sort of external stimulant to lower or raise their body temperature means that they don't have to spend that energy internally. So here's some rock hyraxes, which are in a crevice, probably in the heat of the day, cooling off. All right, fossorial mammals have the benefit of having stable temperatures. So generally, the temperature in the ground does not fluctuate as much as outside. But the cost of this is you have to burrow, you have to create those burrows, and so they generally are adapted with large claws and powerful arms in order to do that. There do seem to be some characteristics which coincide with the subterranean lifestyle, including what's dubbed the subterranean rodent syndrome, where you have a low basal metabolic rate, high and narrow thermoneutral zone, high thermal conductance, and limited thermoregulation. So they're relying almost completely on the environment of the burrows to regulate their temperature. And so naked mole rats are included in this subterranean rodent syndrome, and they have a low metabolic rate. Their thermoneutral zone is high and very narrow, so it's very narrow temperature in which they can regulate their body temperature. And they aren't very good at maintaining their body temperature, and they rely on the burrows. So if they're too warm, they'll have to go to a colder part of the burrow. At night, when they're sleeping, they will huddle together and cuddle, pretty much. And so here's some showing the difference between a single naked mole rat compared to huddling together. You can see it's much more stable and less of a drastic change. They also generally have a high affinity for blood for oxygen in these low oxygen environments. There's not as much air going on in these, transferring through these burrows, and so they have a lot of red blood cells, a lot of hemoglobin per red blood cell, a lot of myoglobin to increase the oxygen affinity. All right, we kind of touched on this before. Aquatic and semi-aquatic mammals have the problem of the thermal conductance of water. It's going to absorb heat much quicker than air. And so fur is often really high in density. So we're looking at like muskrats and otters and beavers. And generally, they have to groom their hair to trap air underneath it, and that allows for another thermal layer. And there's a big difference between the fur when it's completely wet and that air isn't trapped in there, and when it is. And so they'll spend a lot of time grooming to do that. They generally have countercurrent heat exchanges, which we showed in the dolphins as well, with blubber if they don't have a high content of fur density. And they are generally large in size. Some of them also will migrate to warm environments when it's cold, and then return to these colder environments when it's warmer and when the prey are more abundant. Locomotion generally follows three relationships in mammals. The amount of energy used per stride per gram of muscle is the same, independent of size. So however much energy you use for one muscle fiber is the same whether you are small or big or whatever. And how much per stride, so movement of arm and leg, is generally the same. But if you have a longer stride, then you are more efficient in the same movement. The metabolic cost of increasing running speed increases linearly with speed. You can see that here. And that's just the amount of fibers, muscle fibers required to increase the speed is linear. And so is the metabolic cost for doing that. However, the mass-specific use of energy by a running animal decreases by weight. So this also is shown here. A 100-gram chipmunk has to spend a lot more energy to go from 1 to 3 meters per second than a large horse, right? Because, again, that stride, how much it has to do more strides to get to 3 meters per second than a horse does. All right, so that's locomotion. And then we're going to switch to water regulation. There are a few different strategies. Most mammals are periodic drinkers, where they have to drink on a regular interval to get the water that they need. Some mammals, however, live in arid environments and don't have access to water. And so they have to find other sources. And that could include dietary moisture, so found in the plants for food. And so kangaroo rats in the desert eat a lot of succulents that have moisture within them. So cacti have that moisture retained within them. They eat those, they get their water from there. The metabolic water, so this is water released as a byproduct of metabolism, especially carbohydrates. So again, these desert wood rats, or kangaroo rats that live in the desert, they have a high granivorous diet, so the grains that they eat have a lot of carbohydrates in them. When they break down those carbohydrates, it releases water. And so it's actually a very small amount of the water that they get. Oh, actually, it's right here. So if this is what they lose, so they lose water in their feces and urine, and then they have evaporative loss for cooling. And then they have to replace that every day with what they have coming in. So here's the metabolic water, actually a significant amount. There is some water in the seeds, but not very much. And that's the dietary moisture preformed. And reducing then the amount of water in their urine also reduces how much they have to replace. So having a high concentrated urine with very little water occurs in these desert species, as well as it does with marine species. So if marine species are in this environment where it's too salty to drink, they can't get water anywhere else. And even the things that they eat have a high salt concentration. So they have to have very efficient kidneys for reducing the amount of salt, or able to remove that salt and gather the water from it. There is also the turbinate bones, which we talked about before, which help to capture heat as it is released from the body. It also helps to capture moisture as the moist environment of the lungs and the mouth. As you breathe out, you're going to lose moisture, but the turbinate bones actually help to catch that water before it's released and goes through evaporation and condensation events within the turbinate bones, and so all that moisture remains then within the the nasal cavity. And then the actual air released is cooler and drier than the water inside the respiratory tract. There's also the problem with lactation. So females are going to lose a lot of water through their lactation. So some adaptations for that is to recycle that water by drinking and eating the feces and urine of their young, and getting the water out of that, or creating a high protein or low water content of milk. So marine mammals also generally have a very high fat content, lots of energy, with a reduction in the amount of water. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about these specifics in class, and looking forward to it.